Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Liberation Day is almost here when US President Donald Trump unveils reciprocal tariffs against countries imposing charges on US exports. But the closer we get to April 2, US time, the more the president seems to be open to exemptions and a more lenient approach. The extent to which Australia will be hit remains to be seen, and the response by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Opposition Leader Peter Dutton may well have a major impact on the federal election. Peter Hartcher is political editor and international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Peter, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Pleasure, Sean.
You wrote recently that around the world, leaders are being defined by the quality of their defiance of Donald Trump. Now, perhaps no one has done that better than Mark Carney in Canada, but just explain what you mean.
Well, Donald Trump is presenting a different intensity of threat to different countries. The more intense the threat, and Canada is a case study here, the more robust the leaders have to respond, The gentler the threat, the more room leaders have to be more equivocal or less angry. But in the case of Canada, Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister when Trump first said he was going to take over Canada, annex Canada as the 51st state. And Trudeau at that point had been just completely written off by the Canadian electorate and was regarded as a complete, has-been and a waste of time. It took Donald Trump's threats to resuscitate, revitalise Justin Trudeau's standing, and he's left the prime ministership, which was preordained, already had a deadline on it, but it sent him out a hero instead of a villain. And then Mark Carney stepped in and had to calibrate his response, and he's done that in pretty stiff terms. He said, "We will never be part of America. Trump's demands are crazy. Canadians should buy Canadian, and we're going to beef up our independent defence arrangements." Australia was an immediate beneficiary of that because within a few days, within 2 weeks of him taking the prime ministership, he'd agreed to buy a $6.5 billion Jindalee over-the-horizon radar system from Australia, which is by far the biggest foreign defence export Australia has ever made, because Canada wants an ability independently of the US to monitor its northern approaches into the Arctic. So that was his and various countries' leaders who have stood up to Trump have been rewarded. But it has to be intelligent. They can't, you can't just come out and smash him unmitigatedly or unreasonably. The Mexicans have had to be more subtle and more careful and yet still quietly defiant. And that's worked for them. I mean, it's a little different all around the world, but nobody seems to be profiting from just total and abject kowtow to Donald Trump.
What about, let's bring it home then, Anthony Albanese, Peter Dutton. They've got an election to win. How do they handle this issue? And is it harder handling it from government or from opposition?
It really suits neither in a very direct sense, because neither really wanted to conduct their campaign on foreign policy.
Yep.
They each have their little separate corners of designated subjects where they're happiest to campaign. But at the margin, it suits the Liberals better. And it suits the Liberals better because traditionally their brand perception is that they are better at dealing with defence. And the impression among electors, and this is borne out in a poll that we're just publishing now, but that Dutton marginally is better suited to dealing with Donald Trump than Anthony Albanese. Whereas the Labor Party is traditionally seen as a more caring party rather than a sterner, overseeing sort of party. So while the brand's perception of the Liberals is that they're good with defence, national security and fiscal rectitude, take that one with a large grain of historical salt. These are perceptions, of course, rather than realities. Yes. But the Labor Party, on the other hand, is seen as a more caring party, and its strengths are health, education, social security, those softer so-called issues. So it doesn't really suit Albanese, and he didn't want to talk about it. He still tries to avoid talking about it, whether it's China and the Chinese task group that circumnavigated the country, whether it's the Chinese survey group that's off the coast now, or whether it's Donald Trump and Australian foreign policy and the alliance. But when confronted with it, he can't escape it, he does talk about it, but his way of dealing with it is to say that, is to try and link it with Peter Dutton, and to say that, well, you know, these things that Donald Trump is doing, like his rather wild, ham-fisted, chaotic, and self-harming to the US cuts in federal workforce, federal public servants, is exactly what Peter Dutton wants to do, try to paint him indirectly as being some sort of kin to Donald Trump, whereas Peter Dutton approach is to say, I could do a better deal with Trump because Albanese's weak and I'm tough, and I could get him on the phone, which of course is a fiction, but these are the two positions that they're taking. Neither of them desperately want to talk about it, but at the margin, Dutton is happier to talk about it than Albanese.
I want to talk more about the election campaign, about the issues that'll decide the next Prime Minister. We'll be back in a moment. My guest this morning is Peter Hartcher from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. A few days into the election campaign, Peter, how do you think they're both going so far?
Well, it's interesting to see that the Liberals look like they've been taken by surprise, even though they've had 3 years to prepare. A lot of policy not written, a lot of policy that's just vague and general. And they've gone, if you look at the electoral politics of it, they've gone into this on the defensive. So on day one of the campaign, Peter Dutton sat down to lunch with the Chinese business community in Brisbane, trying to mend fences from the last campaign, from the Morrison term, where the Chinese Australian population turned against the Liberals rather decisively because it was troubled by the aggressive rhetoric that Morrison and Dutton used when talking about China. And again, Peter Dutton has gone to a mosque before he's been to a church or a synagogue during the campaign at least, to try to reassure Muslim voters that he's not as horrible as they might think. So that's very much on the defensive. That's trying to patch up known weaknesses. Whereas Albanese very much has gone on the offensive, and his first visit of the campaign was to Peter Dutton's seat of Dixon in outer Brisbane, which Dutton holds by quite a slender margin. It's only around 2%. And it's a direct challenge to Dutton to say, we're not only going to beat you, we're going to try and knock you off your perch as well. So that's quite a contrast.
Will it come down to the cost of living?
I think the cost of living is an indispensable element, but I think the Trump atmospherics change the, if you like, the sort of the meta message or the overall quality of the campaign. And I think this is partly reflected in the change in the published polling in the last couple of months. Albanese Labor, after 2 years lagging, has, in most of the published polls, or in fact all of the published polls, is either now 50-50 or within 1 percentage point of that. So it's a wide open election, but it's improved for Albanese. And although there have been some domestic considerations, the large looming one was the fact that the Reserve Bank started what we will hope is a rate cutting cycle rather than a one-off. But so there have been some domestic changes, but it's also coincided with Trump's aggression on tariffs and on allies and dumping Ukraine and all of that stuff. I think that, and this is also borne out in our polling, that the electorate is feeling anxious because this now adds a new uncertainty. One certainty in Australian public life post-war is that the US is our friend. Well, that's now deeply in question, whether it's a friend or not, or even worse, is it some sort of antagonist? So I think the public is looking for reassurance, and the party that can reassure their economic certainty at home, cost of living, future income prospects, future growth, and also the sort of national existential sense of uncertainty now that we seem to be adrift in a turbulent world. The phrase I've used in print is that without serious proposals from either party for an actual economic rejuvenation of Australia or a convincing security and defence policy from either party, that we are heading into a tempest riding in a tinny. And voters want an answer to that. They don't feel good about that. They want to feel better.
In your time, I was going to call you a veteran, Peter, but you're not. You're a junior who's been around a long time. Tell me, tell me, have we ever had a campaign, I mean, since the 60s, I suppose, that we've had such an outside influence on how people are thinking?
Well, there's a couple of things to say about that. As you say, Sean, the last time, and I consulted an expert, a military historian, Peter Dean, who also happened to be the co-author of the current government's Defence Strategic Review. When was the last time that the defence budget was a significant part, debate over the defence budget was a significant part of an election campaign? And he said, yes, it would have been in the early 60s when Menzies was in power and the confrontasi crisis with Indonesia was underway. But this is, if you cast the net slightly more broadly, this is the second consecutive campaign we've had where foreign policy has intruded into domestic affairs. Last time, the 2022 campaign, when Morrison was in power, you'll remember it was the shock that China had signed a security deal with the Solomon Islands. And that really harmed the Morrison government because it exposed them as being incompetent in foreign policy, and that really damaged them. So it wasn't defence spending, but it's certainly security related. And that's now 2 in a row. And can I suggest, I'd be so bold as to suggest, Sean, that this will become a permanent feature of our politics, because the 2 principal sources of disruption are not going away. And they are, of course, China's ambitions for domination and America's unsettling and Donald Trump's overturning of the entire global order.
It kind of makes for an interesting election. I'm not sure the fun's the right word, but it certainly makes for an interesting election, Peter.
Yeah, well, these are big problems and big threats, and it's no wonder the parties don't really want to talk about them because they don't have ready solutions.
Yeah.
The Liberals have promised us that they're going to spend more money on defence than Labor, and they're going to give us the details of that in the weeks ahead. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. Whereas Labor has really just slightly rescheduled some of its already announced defence spending, obviously thinking that they don't need to do anything more. But I think both parties are really a bit stuck here because they want to look as if they're active and responsive, but they don't have answers, and they don't want to seem to be unsettling the electorate. So it's a delicate line they have to walk between being vigilant and being competent, but yet not alarming anybody and trying to reassure the public as well. And I don't think either side's got that right yet.
Peter, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Always a pleasure, Sean.
That's Peter Hartcher, political editor and international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. This is the Fear and Greed business interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.